Close your eyes and let me take you back in time. Far, far back to the land of the Pharaohs, where the mighty Nile River flows like a ribbon of life through golden sands. Tonight we'll follow the journey of a man named Sinuhe, whose story was written on papyrus scrolls nearly 4,000 years ago, when the pyramids were already ancient. Picture yourself floating down the Nile on a gentle reed boat. The stars of ancient Egypt twinkling above you like diamonds scattered across black silk. The air is warm and sweet with the scent of lotus blossoms. And in the distance, you can hear the soft lapping of water against the riverbank. Our story begins in the great palace of Pharaoh Amenemhat I, in the capital city of Ichtawi. The palace walls were painted with scenes of birds and papyrus plants, and the floors were covered with soft reed mats. Sinuhe was a trusted attendant to Princess Neferu, daughter of the pharaoh, and he lived a comfortable life within these sacred walls. Sinuhe was a thoughtful man with gentle eyes and skilled hands. Each morning, he would wake to the sound of temple bells echoing across the Nile. And he would dress in clean, white linen robes that rustled softly as he walked through the palace corridors. His days were filled with quiet duties, organizing the princess's jewelry, ensuring her chambers were filled with fresh flowers, and accompanying her on peaceful walks through the palace gardens. The gardens were a wonder to behold. Date palms swayed gently in the breeze, their fronds creating dancing shadows on the stone pathways. Pools of clear water reflected the sky, and small fish swam lazily beneath lily pads. The air was filled with the soft humming of bees and the distant songs of palace musicians practicing their melodies. Sinuhe found great peace in these gardens. He would often sit beside the pools in the evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, thinking about the simple pleasures of his life. The taste of fresh bread with honey, the feel of cool stone beneath his feet, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the palace courtyards. But life, even in a palace, can change as quickly as the shifting sands of the desert. One day, as Sinuhe was returning from an expedition with Prince Sesostris, terrible news arrived. Pharaoh Amenemhat had died suddenly, and the palace was thrown into chaos. In those ancient times, the death of a pharaoh meant uncertainty, political upheaval, and sometimes danger for those who served the royal family. Sinuhe felt fear creep into his heart like a cold shadow. He had heard whispers of palace intrigues, of those who might not welcome the new pharaoh's rule. Without thinking clearly, driven by panic and worry, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He decided to flee Egypt. Picture Sinuhe gathering his few possessions in the dim light of dawn. His hands trembled as he folded his spare robe and tucked a small pouch of silver into his belt. He took one last look at the palace that had been his home. Its walls still draped in a soft purple shadows of early morning. The lotus pools lay still and peaceful, unaware that their regular visitor would never return. He slipped out through a side gate, his sandals making soft sounds on the stone path. The Nile stretched before him, its waters reflecting the pale pink sky of sunrise. Birds were beginning their morning songs, and the air smelled of river mud and growing things, the eternal scent of Egypt that would soon become just a memory. Sinuhe walked northward, following paths he had never traveled before. Each step took him further from everything familiar into a world of uncertainty. The sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders through his linen robe. His throat grew dry, and his feet began to ache. But still he walked on, driven by his fears and the desperate hope that he might find safety somewhere beyond Egypt's borders. As the day wore on, the familiar sights of home gradually disappeared. The carefully tended fields gave way to wilder landscapes, and the comfortable sounds of village life faded into the distance. Sinuhe was truly alone now, carrying nothing but his fears and hopes into an unknown future. The next part of Sinuhe's journey took him through the harsh beauty of the Sinai Peninsula. Here, the gentle banks of the Nile gave way to rolling dunes of golden sand that stretched endlessly under the vast blue sky. The desert was a place of extremes, scorching heat during the day, bitter cold at night, and a silence so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. Let your mind wander into this ancient desert with Sinuhe. Feel the soft sand beneath your feet, still cool from the night. The early morning air is crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of hardy desert plants, tiny flowers that bloom briefly after rare rains, and thorny shrubs that somehow find life in this seemingly barren place. Sinuhe learned to travel in the early hours of dawn and the gentle time of dusk, resting during the heat of midday in whatever shade he could find. Sometimes this was the shadow of a large rock, sometimes the meager shelter of a desert plant. He would lie still, feeling the warmth of the sand through his robe, listening to the absolute silence of the desert, a silence so pure it seemed almost musical. The nights were magical in their own way. When the sun disappeared behind the dunes, the temperature would drop quickly, and Sinuhe would wrap himself in his cloak and look up at a sky absolutely brilliant with stars. In the desert, far from any city or town, the stars seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and shooting stars would occasionally streak across the darkness like brief, bright wishes. During these quiet nights, Sinuhe would think about his homeland. He would remember the sound of temple bells at dawn, the sight of ibis birds wading in the Nile's shallows, the taste of dates fresh from the palm trees. These memories were both comforting and painful. They reminded him of the life he had left behind, perhaps forever. Water was precious in the desert, and Sinuhe learned to appreciate every drop. He would sometimes find small oases, magical places where palm trees grew around clear springs, and the sound of trickling water seemed like the most beautiful music in the world. He would drink slowly, gratefully, feeling the cool water soothe his parched throat and restore his strength. The desert taught Sinuhe patience and resilience. Each day brought new challenges, but also small wonders. The way the sand created flowing patterns in the wind, the surprising colors of a desert sunset, the delicate beauty of a tiny flower blooming in impossible conditions. Gradually, his initial panic began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of his own strength and resourcefulness. After many days of travel, Sinuhe finally reached the land of Retenu in what we now call the Levant. This was a green and fertile country, very different from both Egypt and the desert he had crossed. Rolling hills covered with olive groves and vineyards stretched as far as the eye could see. Clear streams bubbled down from the mountains, and the air was sweet with the scent of wild flowers and herbs. The people of Retenu were different from the Egyptians Sinuhe had known. They wore colorful robes woven with intricate patterns, and their speech had a musical quality that was pleasant to hear, even though he didn't understand their words at first. They were skilled farmers and herders, and their villages were built on hilltops overlooking the fertile valleys below. At first, Sinuhe was just a wanderer, a stranger seeking shelter and food. But his Egyptian education and courtly manners soon caught the attention of the local leaders. In those days, a man who could read and write was rare and valuable. Sinuhe found himself welcomed into the household of Amenenchi, a powerful chieftain who ruled over a large territory. Amenenchi was a wise and generous man with a long beard streaked with silver and eyes that seemed to see into a person's heart. He had daughters who were beautiful and intelligent, and sons who were strong and brave. His house was built of stone and cedar wood, with gardens where pomegranates and figs grew in abundance. "You are far from home, Egyptian," Amenenchi said to Sinuhe one evening as they sat in the cool courtyard, sharing a meal of bread, olives, and goat cheese. "But you are welcome here for as long as you wish to stay." Sinuhe felt tears come to his eyes at this kindness. For the first time since leaving Egypt, he felt truly safe and welcome. That night, he slept on a soft bed of sheepskins, listening to the gentle night sounds of this foreign land, a soft lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves in the olive groves, the distant sound of a shepherd's flute. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Sinuhe learned the language of Retenu and gradually became a trusted advisor to Amenenchi. He helped settle disputes between neighboring villages, advised on trade negotiations, and even taught the chieftain's children to read and write Egyptian hieroglyphs. But perhaps the greatest gift Retenu offered Sinuhe was love. Amenenchi's eldest daughter, Merit, was a woman of grace and wisdom. She had dark hair that caught the sunlight like silk, and gentle hands that were skilled in weaving and healing. She and Sinuhe found themselves drawn to each other, sharing quiet conversations in the evening gardens, walking together through the olive groves, discovering the deep joy of two souls finding their perfect match. Their wedding was a celebration that lasted for 3 days. The entire village participated, with music and dancing, feasting and storytelling. Sinuhe wore a robe of fine wool dyed deep blue, and Merit was dressed in white linen embroidered with flowers. They exchanged vows under an ancient olive tree, with the blessing of both the gods of Egypt and the gods of Retenu. The years that followed were perhaps the happiest of Sinuhe's life. He and Merit had children, sons who were strong and daughters who were beautiful. They lived in a house of their own, with a garden where they grew vegetables and herbs. Sinuhe became prosperous, owning flocks of sheep and goats and fields of grain that waved golden in the summer breeze. But even in this paradise, Sinuhe sometimes found himself standing on the hills at sunset, looking south toward Egypt, wondering about the land of his birth. Life in Retenu was not always peaceful. The various tribes and clans sometimes fought with each other over grazing rights, water sources, or matters of honor. Sinuhe, as a trusted advisor to Ameneshi, sometimes found himself involved in these conflicts. One day, a mighty warrior from a neighboring tribe came to challenge Sinuhe. This man was called Akish, and he was known throughout the land for his strength and skill with weapons. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with scars from many battles, and he boasted that no man could defeat him in single combat. "I have heard of the Egyptian who thinks himself better than the men of Retenu," Akish declared, in a voice like thunder. "Let him prove his worth with spear and sword, or let him be known as a coward forever." Sinuhe felt his heart racing with fear. He was not a warrior by nature. He was a man of words and wisdom, not violence. But the honor of his adopted family and tribe was at stake, and he could not refuse the challenge without bringing shame upon those who had welcomed him. The night before the combat, Sinuhe sat alone in his garden, listening to the gentle sounds of evening. His wife Merit came to him, placing her hand softly on his shoulder. "You are afraid," she said gently. "That is not shameful. Even the bravest warriors feel fear." "I am not a warrior," Sinuhe replied. "I am a man of peace. How can I hope to defeat one who lives for battle?" Merit smiled and pointed to the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "The gods of Egypt are with you, and the gods of Retenu as well. Trust in their protection and in your own courage. Sometimes the gentlest stream can wear down the hardest stone." The next morning, the entire village gathered to witness the combat. The sun was bright and warm, and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers. Sinuhe said a prayer to the gods of both his lands, asking not for victory, but for the courage to face whatever might come. The battle was fierce but brief. Akish charged like a wild bull, his spear flashing in the sunlight, but Sinuhe, guided by some divine inspiration, managed to dodge the thrust and strike back with his own weapon. In a moment that seemed to last forever, the mighty warrior fell, defeated. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Sinuhe found himself lifted up and carried on the shoulders of the celebrating villagers. But he took no joy in the defeat of his opponent. Instead, he knelt beside the fallen warrior and offered him water and gentle words, showing the mercy that marked him as a man of true nobility. This victory brought Sinuhe great honor and respect throughout the land of Retenu, but it also stirred something deep in his heart, a longing for the land of his birth that he had tried so hard to forget. As the years passed in Retenu, Sinuhe found himself increasingly homesick for Egypt. It began as a small ache in his heart, like the memory of a half-forgotten song, but gradually it grew stronger until it became a constant presence in his thoughts. He would dream of the Nile, flowing eternal and life-giving through the desert. He would wake with tears on his cheeks, remembering the sound of temple bells at dawn, the sight of ibis birds walking in the shallows, the taste of fresh dates and barley bread. The smell of lotus blossoms would come to him in quiet moments, so real he would look around expecting to see the familiar flowers floating on palace pools. His children, born in Retenu, could not understand this longing. To them, the hills and valleys of their homeland were the most beautiful places in the world. They spoke the language of Retenu as their mother tongue, and Egypt was just a distant land from their father's stories. But Merit, wise and loving, understood. We find Sinuhe standing alone in their garden at sunset, his eyes turned toward the south, and she would stand beside him without speaking, offering the comfort of her presence. "You must go back," she told him one evening, her voice soft but certain. "Your heart will never be at peace until you see Egypt again." "But how can I leave you?" Sinuhe asked. "You are my life, my happiness. Our children need their father, and you need your homeland," Merit replied. "I have seen how you watch the birds flying south in autumn, how you treasure every trader's tale from Egypt. Go, my beloved. Make your peace with the land of your birth. If the gods will it, you will return to us." Around this time, news came that the political situation in Egypt had stabilized. The new pharaoh, Sesostris, had proven himself a wise and just ruler. Perhaps, Sinuhe thought, it might be safe to return, even if only for a visit. The decision was not easy. Sinuhe had built a good life in retinue. He had wealth, respect, a loving family, but the pull of his homeland was like a river current, impossible to resist. He began to dream of walking once more along the banks of the Nile, of hearing the familiar sounds of his native language, of seeing the great pyramids rising from the dead sands. Finally, after much prayer and thought, Sinuhe made his decision. He would return to Egypt, not as a fugitive, but as a man seeking forgiveness and the chance to die in the land of his birth. If the pharaoh rejected him, at least he would have tried. If death awaited him there, at least it would be Egyptian soil that received his bones. The preparations for departure were bittersweet. Sinuhe arranged for his affairs and retinue to be managed by his eldest son, a young man who had inherited his father's wisdom and his mother's gentle strength. He embraced his daughters, memorizing their faces, breathing in the sweet scent of their hair. The hardest parting was with Merit. They stood together in their garden one last time, surrounded by the flower that he had planted, the trees they had watched grow from saplings. She gave him the small amulet she had made, carved with symbols of protection from both Egyptian and retinue traditions. "Carry this," she said, "and remember that you are loved, no matter how far you travel." And so, with a heart full of both hope and sorrow, Sinuhe began the long journey back to Egypt. The journey back to Egypt was very different from Sinuhe's flight many years before. This time, he traveled not as a desperate fugitive, but as a man of experience and wisdom. The desert, which had once seemed like a hostile enemy, now felt like an old friend with familiar moods and rhythms. As he crossed the border into Egypt, Sinuhe felt his heart lift with a joy he had almost forgotten was possible. The air smelled different, dustier, drier, but achingly familiar. The landscape was exactly as he remembered it, the green ribbon of the Nile Valley cutting through golden desert, the date palms swaying in the eternal breeze, the mud brick villages clustered along the riverbank. But Sinuhe was nervous too. Would the pharaoh remember him? Would he be welcome? Or would he be seen as a traitor who had abandoned his homeland in its hour of need? He sent a message ahead, formally requesting an audience and throwing himself on the mercy of the royal court. The response came more quickly than he had dared hope. Not only was he forgiven, but Pharaoh Sesostris himself wished to see him. The messenger who brought this news was kind and respectful, treating Sinuhe not as a criminal, but as a valued subject returning home. The journey to the palace was like a dream. Every familiar sight brought tears to Sinuhe's eyes. The fishermen casting their nets in the Nile, the children playing in the village squares, the farmers working in the eternal rhythm of planting and harvest. Even the dust and heat, which had once seemed oppressive, now felt like a warm embrace. When Sinuhe finally stood before Pharaoh Sesostris, he was overwhelmed by the ruler's kindness. The pharaoh, now middle-aged and wise, looked at the travel-worn man before him with eyes full of understanding. "Welcome home, faithful Sinuhe," the pharaoh said. "We have missed your wisdom and your loyal service." Sinuhe fell to his knees, overcome with gratitude and belief. Your Majesty, I am not worthy of such kindness. I fled when I should have stayed, abandoned my duties when you needed me most. You were afraid, Sesostris replied gently. That is human and forgivable. You have lived with honor in a foreign land, and now you have returned to us. That is all that matters. The pharaoh ordered that Sinuhe be given a house near the palace, servants to attend him, and all the comforts befitting a man of his station. But the greatest gift was simply being home, being able to walk once more along the banks of the Nile, to hear the familiar sounds of his native language, to worship in the temples of his childhood. Sinuhe's final years in Egypt were peaceful and fulfilling. He served as an advisor to the pharaoh, sharing the wisdom he had gained from his years in foreign lands. He helped negotiate trade agreements with the peoples of retinue, and his knowledge of their customs and language proved invaluable. But he never forgot his second family. He sent messages to Merit and his children, and they wrote back with news of their lives. His eldest son had become a respected leader in his own right, and his daughters had married and had children of their own. The knowledge that his family in retinue was happy and prosperous brought Sinuhe great peace. In his house near the palace, Sinuhe created a garden that reflected both his Egyptian heritage and his years in retinue. He grew papyrus and lotus flowers alongside olive trees and grapevines. In the evenings, he would sit by a small pool, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors, feeling the eternal rhythm of the Nile beneath his feet. Sometimes, young scribes would come to him, asking him to tell them about his adventures in foreign lands. Sinuhe would share his stories, but always with the message that while the world was wide and full of wonders, there was no place like home. As he grew older, Sinuhe began to prepare for his final journey. He had his tomb prepared in the traditional Egyptian manner, with all the proper spells and amulets to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. But he also included small tokens from his years in retinue: a piece of olive wood, a handful of soil from his garden there, a small clay lamp that Merit had made. And so ends the story of Sinuhe, the Egyptian who journeyed far from home only to discover that the greatest adventure of all was the journey back to himself. His tale, written on papyrus nearly 4,000 years ago, reminds us that home is not just a place, but a feeling carried in the heart. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Sinuhe's journey. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right despite being afraid. Remember that kindness can be found in the most unexpected places, and that love transcends all boundaries of language and culture. Picture yourself floating gently down the eternal Nile, carried by currents of time and memory toward your own peaceful rest. The stars that shone on Sinuhe's journey still shine above us tonight, connecting us to all the travelers who have sought their way home across the centuries. Let the gentle rhythm of the river carry you into dreams, where you too can journey through ancient lands and discover the treasures that await those who are brave enough to venture forth and wise enough to find their way back home. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the magic of ancient stories and the eternal promise of new dawns breaking over the timeless river of life.